Some people don't meet their end through storms, disasters, or fate. They meet it by doing something so simple and so unbelievably avoidable that nature barely has to lift a finger. One small choice, one quiet mistake, and the story is over. Tonight, we're looking at the moments where ordinary people walk straight into their own endings, not with chaos, but with confidence in the wrong idea at the wrong time. No villains, no mysteries, just everyday decisions that turned fatal fast. Let's begin. Number 1. Jason Miller, 42, from Salem, Oregon, wasn't a risk taker, just a tired night shift worker trying to get home after a long shift. Stuck behind brake lights on Highway 22, his GPS offered him a quicker route. 9 minutes faster. He took it without thinking. The road started normal, then pavement became gravel. Gravel became dirt, and the dirt thinned into something that didn't look like a road at all. Jason slowed, told himself it was fine, and kept going. What he didn't know was that last week's storm had washed out part of the path. The warning barrier had been moved aside, and in the dark, the missing ground looked like nothing more than a shadow. He rolled forward until his tires reached the edge. By the time he hit the brakes, the car was already tilting into the drop. No drama, no noise, just a quiet mistake on a quiet night. Jason wasn't being reckless. He was just trying to save a few minutes, trusting a shortcut more than his own tired instincts. Number 2. Angela Torres, 29, lived alone in a small apartment on the edge of Lubbock, Texas. Quiet life, steady job, nothing unusual. But everyone has that one home problem they think they can fix themselves. For Angela, it was the bathroom light. It flickered for weeks, not dead, just annoying. She ignored it, then tolerated it. Then one night at 11:30, after a long shift at the diner, she decided she was finally done with this stupid thing. Most people would wait for morning or call maintenance, or at least turn off the power. Angela did none of those. She grabbed a metal chair, climbed up barefoot, and unscrewed the cover with one hand while holding her phone flashlight in the other. The bulb was stuck. She twisted harder. It squeaked, slipped, then shattered in her fingers. She hissed in pain, not because it was deep, but because it startled her. She stepped back, forgetting she was standing on a wobbly chair. The chair tipped. She didn't. Her instinctive grab for balance sent her hand straight into the open light socket. The neighbors reported hearing a thump, followed by silence. When they found her, the chair was sideways, the bulb pieces scattered, her phone still showing the flashlight she'd been using. It wasn't some dramatic electrical storm or complex wiring failure. Just a tired woman late at night, trying to fix a light bulb the fast way. The kind of mistake almost everyone thinks they'd never make, until they're tired enough to try. Number 3, Daniel. Danny Ruiz, 33, lived in Fresno, California. A warehouse forklift operator, friendly guy. 33, everyone liked him. But he had one flaw that followed him everywhere. He hated waiting, especially for trains. One evening after work, he was heading home on East Olive Avenue when the red lights started flashing at a railroad crossing. The long freight trains always drove him crazy. Slow, loud, endless. Danny pulled up, checked the time, sighed, and said what a lot of impatient people say to themselves, "I can make it! It's barely moving!" The arms came down. He didn't care. He looked left, saw the train crawling in from the distance. He looked right, saw nothing. His brain filled in the rest. It's safe enough. He pulled around the first barrier, eased onto the tracks, and pressed the gas. What he didn't notice was the second engine, a smaller service locomotive coming from the other direction, nearly silent compared to the freight train, and partially hidden behind a row of parked rail cars. The engineer hit the horn. Danny hit the gas. Both were too late. The impact wasn't even dramatic, just a short, heavy hit that pushed his car 20 feet sideways into the gravel. Paramedics said didn't survive the impact. Neighbors who saw the aftermath told reporters the same thing every witness says after a simple, preventable tragedy. It only takes one wrong assumption. Danny didn't try anything wild. He wasn't showing off. He wasn't speeding. He just wanted to get home a little faster and misjudged a train by 3 seconds. Number 4. Michael Grant, 27, lived in an older apartment building in Toledo, Ohio, the kind where the maintenance guy always says he'll come tomorrow. His bathroom vent had been broken for weeks. Steam everywhere. Every day, one Saturday. Tired of waiting, Michael decided he'd fix it himself. The vent duct led up to the roof, so he climbed out the window with a borrowed toolbox and followed the metal pipe across the damp surface. At the end was a rusted cap that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. He knelt, twisted it, felt it loosen, and pulled harder. The entire base, weakened by rust, gave out in his hands. Michael lost his balance, reached for the pipe, missed, and slid backward toward the edge before he even processed what was happening. Neighbors heard a quick crash and found him in the alley below. A short fall, just high enough, just wrong enough to end everything. There was nothing dramatic about it. Just a guy trying to fix one small problem on his own and slipping into the kind of ending no one ever thinks will happen to them. Number 5. Karen Whitfield, 54, lived in Missoula, Montana, and worked long shifts at a veterinary clinic. She loved her job, loved animals, loved her coworkers, but the hours drained her. One morning, after barely sleeping, she decided to stop at a quiet rest area off Highway 93 before heading into work. Just a quick nap. 15 minutes. She parked under a big pine tree, reclined her seat, and closed her eyes. The mistake wasn't the nap. It was where she parked. The hillside above the rest area had been unstable for months after heavy spring melt, and the state had put up warning signs, small, faded ones no one really pays attention to. While Karen slept, a section of loose earth finally gave way. It wasn't a dramatic landslide, no roaring, no waves of dirt, just a slow slump of mud and rock that shifted down the slope. One large boulder, loosened just enough, rolled free. It bounced once, twice, then angled toward the parking lot like it had been waiting for an audience. Her car was the only one there. The impact was immediate. The vehicle crushed inward, exactly where she was resting. Drivers who pulled in minutes later thought it was an accident most people do. Because the idea that something as simple as pulling over for a nap can turn fatal feels too random to believe. But life rarely checks if you're ready. Karen just needed a moment of rest. The hillside decided it was the wrong day for it. Number 6. The last-minute check, short and safe. Thomas Tom Bradley, 38, from Augusta, Georgia, loved fixing his own car. Nothing advanced, just enough to feel like the neighborhood car guy. One evening, he noticed the car pulling slightly to the right. Most people would wait for morning or go to a shop. Tom? He grabbed his old secondhand jack and slid under the car in the fading light. The ground was still soft from earlier rain, and the jack wasn't built for uneven dirt. Tom didn't bother with a stand or wedge. He just started tugging at a stubborn bolt. The car shifted, just a tiny movement, but enough. The jack sank, tipped sideways, and the car dropped before he had a chance to react. Neighbors found him minutes later. Flashlight still on Tom, wasn't reckless, just confident in a tool that had worked every other time. Sometimes, that's all it takes. Number 7. Ethan Wallace, 24, grew up in Flagstaff, Arizona. The kind of guy who loved the outdoors more than the indoors. Hiking, camping, fishing. That was his life. He wasn't a risk taker. He was actually cautious, always telling friends to respect nature. Which makes this story sting a little more. One cool October morning, Ethan and his girlfriend Nora drove out to a quiet campsite near Walnut Canyon. Perfect weather, clear skies, everything peaceful. But the trouble started when Ethan tried to light the campfire. Normally, he used matches or a lighter, but this time, he forgot both in the car, which he'd parked a quarter-mile away at the trail entrance. Most people would just walk back and grab them. Ethan, trying to save time, said, "It's fine, I've got a way." His way was a half-full bottle of old camp stove fuel he found in his backpack. It worked like lighter fluid, in theory. In reality, the canister had a worn nozzle that leaked more liquid than it poured. He didn't test it. He didn't think. He just knelt down and squeezed the bottle over the stacked logs. A thin stream of fuel dripped, then sprayed, then splashed far wider than he expected. Some soaked the logs, some hit the dirt, some landed on his pant leg. He didn't notice. He set the bottle aside, crouched down, and used the spark wheel on his camping stove to ignite a small flame. One spark. That's all it took. The fire didn't start at the logs. It started at his shoe, racing up the thin layer of fuel on his jeans. He tried to pat it out, but the more he moved, the faster the flames crawled. Nora screamed for help, but they were alone. He ran instinctively. The worst thing someone on fire can do, fanning the flames with every step. By the time Nora managed to smother the fire with a blanket, Ethan had collapsed. Paramedics airlifted him, but the burns were too severe. Investigators later said the same thing they say at dozens of campsites every year. It wasn't carelessness, it was overconfidence in a shortcut. Ethan respected nature. He just forgot that fire doesn't care who you are or how experienced you think you've become. Number 8. Rachel Monroe, 31, lived in Birmingham, Alabama, and always walked to the same route home from her office downtown. It was only a few blocks. Lit, familiar, routine. She knew every cracked sidewalk, every flickering street lamp, every storefront window. But routines can make people feel safe in places that aren't. One evening, Rachel left work late. Most of the city had already settled into that quiet, in-between darkness. Not night, not evening, just empty. She popped in her earbuds, turned on a true crime podcast, ironically, and started walking. Halfway home, she reached a section of sidewalk taped off for repair. The construction crew had dug a deep rectangular trench earlier that week to replace old sewer lines. 6 feet deep, wider than a doorway, covered only by plastic fencing, and a warning sign. Rachel stopped at the barricade. She could take the detour around the block, 3 extra minutes, or she could do what she always did. Step through the small gap in the fencing where people had been sneaking through all week. She sighed and muttered, "I'll be fine," and slipped past the sign. The problem was simple. It was darker than usual. One of the streetlights had burned out, and her attention wasn't on the path. It was on a dramatic plot twist in her headphones. She walked forward, trusting memory more than sight. Her foot hovered over the trench before her brain had time to register the void. Construction workers arriving at 6 a.m. found her at the bottom. No struggle marks, no signs of foul play, just a woman who walked straight into the one place she'd walked around 100 times. Routine can make danger invisible. Rachel learned that on a quiet street she thought she knew better than she did. Number 9. Mark Delaney, 46, from Eugene, Oregon, was a weekend kayaker. Not an expert, not even particularly skilled, but he loved the calm of the water, the silence, the idea of escaping for a few hours. On a cloudy Sunday morning, he went out to Fern Ridge Lake, just west of town. It was early, the water looked peaceful, and the wind was low. Perfect conditions, at least at the shore. Mark paddled out further than usual, letting the current pull him toward the narrower northern channel. Something experienced kayakers avoid because the wind funnels between the hills, building speed fast. Mark didn't know that. He just thought it looked scenic. About half a mile out, the breeze picked up. Harmless at first, then stronger. Mark shrugged and kept paddling. The water lifted, small waves, then bigger ones. Nothing dramatic, but enough to make the kayak wobble. He panicked, turned sideways, and made the mistake beginners fear most. He tried to correct the tilt by leaning downhill instead of uphill. The kayak flipped instantly. Mark surfaced, gasping, but the wind pushed the kayak away faster than he could swim. He wasn't wearing a life jacket. "I'll be close to shore," he'd said that morning. But Fern Ridge isn't deep until you're far out. And Mark was far out. A fisherman spotted the overturned kayak drifting alone around noon. It took divers 2 hours to find him, Mark didn't die because of a storm or a rogue wave. He died because he misjudged a quiet lake that changed its mood faster than he expected and trusted his swimming skills more than the simple click of a life vest buckle. Number 10. Harold Collins, 62, was a retired machinist in Syracuse, New York, known in his neighborhood as the guy who could fix anything. To his credit, he often could. Fans, lawnmowers, snowblowers, radios, you name it. He kept an old workshop in his garage filled with tools and half-repaired projects. But Harold had one terrible habit. He almost never unplugged something before working on it. One chilly November morning, he was fixing an antique table fan a neighbor dropped off. The wiring was ancient, cloth-wrapped, brittle, unsafe. Harold knew all this. He even said aloud, "These old ones will bite you if you're not careful." Then he plugged it in anyway. The fan hummed, sputtered, then sparked lightly. Harold frowned, grabbed a screwdriver, and leaned in close. Instead of turning it off, he tried to adjust the wiring by hand, a move he'd gotten away with dozens of times over the years. But this model had an exposed capacitor, a component that stores electrical charge even when the power is off, and especially when it's on the shock hit him in the chest hard enough to freeze every muscle mid-motion. He fell backward, hitting the floor with the kind of dull thud that gets no second chance. His wife found him minutes later when she came to check on the smell of ozone drifting from the garage. Investigators called it accidental electrocution during maintenance. His wife called it a bad habit he kept for 50 years. Harold didn't die doing anything reckless. Just a small job in a familiar place with one simple step skipped. Number 11. Leonard Hayes, 58, lived in Buffalo, New York, in an old two-story house that came with all the usual Buffalo problems. Snow in winter, leaks in spring, and basements that collected water if you even thought about rain. One Saturday afternoon, after a night of heavy storms, Leonard noticed a thin pool of water spreading across the basement floor. Not a flood, just enough to annoy him. He grabbed a push broom, a portable shop light, and a long extension cord. The smart thing would have been to keep the light upstairs and shine it down, but Leonard wanted brightness, real visibility, as he called it. So he plugged the shop light into the extension cord, walked it down the wooden steps, and set it directly on the wet floor. He wasn't careless. He was just focused. Focused people overlook the most obvious danger. He started sweeping the water toward the drain, pushing it right around the base of the shop light. He didn't notice the frayed area in the cord. He didn't notice the low hum growing louder as the light buzzed. All he noticed was a sudden sharp crack, like someone snapping a board in two, followed by a flash of white across his vision. Neighbors later said the power in the whole block flickered for a moment. When first responders arrived, Leonard was still holding the broom. Frozen mid-motion investigators didn't have to search for a cause. It was lying on the floor, a glowing shop light sitting in a pool of water. Leonard didn't die in a flood. He died trying to clean one up. Number 12. Sharon Sherry Perkins, 44, lived in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and worked early shifts at a local bakery. The kind of job where your day starts before the sun even remembers it exists. In mid-January, after a brutal cold snap, she woke up to a driveway coated in a thin, nearly invisible layer of ice. She knew it was there. She even mentioned it to her husband. "Looks slick. I'll be careful." But careful is a flexible word at 4:30 a.m. Instead of walking along the salted path he had made the night before, Sherry decided to take the direct line from her front door to the driver's seat of her SUV, a diagonal route across the untreated middle section of the driveway. One step, then another, then the kind of micro-slip that feels like a warning from the universe. She caught herself once, laughed nervously, and kept going. 10 more steps. Halfway across, her feet shot out from under her so fast she didn't even have time to reach for anything. She fell hard and didn't recover. The neighbor's camera caught the whole thing. Just a sudden fall, then stillness. Her husband found her minutes later when she didn't start the car like she always did. Paramedics said the same quiet line they've said 100 times in Minnesota winters. It only takes one patch. Sherry didn't take a risk. She didn't ignore a warning. She simply took a shorter path on a colder morning and never reached her car. Number 13. Caleb Jennings, 52, from Spokane, Washington, loved fishing more than anything else. Not the competitive kind, just the quiet, patient hours standing by the river, letting the day drift by. One early spring afternoon, after a week of rain, Caleb walked down to his usual spot along the Spokane River. The water was higher than normal, fast, brown, full of silt, but to him, it was nothing unusual. He'd fished that stretch his whole life. The problem was the riverbank. The storms had softened the soil so much that an entire section was basically mud held together by luck. Caleb didn't notice. He just stepped onto the familiar patch, cast his line, and leaned a little forward, the way he always did. The ground gave out silently beneath him. One moment he was standing on solid earth. The next he was chest-deep in freezing water, dragged sideways by a current he wasn't ready for. He tried to grab a branch. Missed. Tried again. Missed again. The weight of his soaked clothes pulled him under, and the current carried him downstream faster than anyone on shore could react. A jogger found his fishing gear the next morning, neatly resting on the collapsed edge of mud where the river had taken him. Caleb didn't underestimate nature. He underestimated mud, the softest, quietest danger in the Northwest. Number 14. Linda Carpenter, 63, lived in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, and spent every Sunday morning doing the same thing: church, grocery store, home. She liked routine. Routine made life simple, but a simple routine can hide a quiet danger. On a windy March morning, Linda pulled into her usual grocery store parking lot. She parked far out. She liked avoiding tight spaces, and grabbed her reusable bags from the back seat. The wind was stronger than she expected. Her passenger door swung open harder than she liked, so she pushed it closed and hurried inside. By the time she came back out with her groceries, the wind had picked up even more. Rows of shopping carts rattled in their metal shelters. Plastic bags floated across the asphalt. Linda loaded her groceries carefully, closed her trunk, and moved to return her cart. That's when she made the small decision that cost her everything. Instead of walking the cart all the way to the corral, a good 40 feet away, she decided to wedge it against a curb near her car. Just for a second. But the wind didn't care about her second. As she stepped behind her SUV to adjust a bag that had fallen, a gust hit the cart. The wheels turned. The cart rolled downhill, and yes, slowly at first, then faster. Picking up just enough speed to become a problem, Linda didn't see it until the last moment. She turned just as the cart slammed into her knees, knocking her backward. She fell hard, her head striking the concrete parking block behind her. A couple saw her fall, but by the time they reached her, she wasn't breathing. The official report called it a blunt force fall caused by a moving shopping cart. The kind of phrase that sounds impossible until the wind is strong enough and the timing is wrong enough. Linda didn't slip, didn't trip, didn't take a risk. She just chose convenience over the cart corral. On the one windy morning she shouldn't have. Number 15, Ronald Ron Becker, 57, lived in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and had one hobby that both his wife and neighbors hated. He fixed things that didn't need fixing. Every Sunday, Ron went around the house checking stuff: faucets that worked, pipes that didn't leak, outlets that functioned perfectly fine. He just needed a project. One weekend, he noticed a slow drip under the kitchen sink. Nothing dramatic, barely enough to wet a paper towel. His wife said, "We can call a plumber tomorrow." Ron shook his head. "It's a 10-minute fix." He slid a bucket underneath, grabbed a wrench, and crawled into the tight space of the cabinet. The pipe was old, stiff, and slightly corroded. The kind of piping that plumbers approach like unexploded fireworks. Ron didn't know that he just grabbed the nut and cranked it with a force that surprised even him. The pipe snapped instantly, spraying cold water into his face. Startled, he jerked backwards, smacking his head on the underside of the sink. Still irritated, he reached blindly for the shut-off valve, but instead grabbed the garbage disposal switch. The roar of the disposal startled him again, this time badly. He jerked, twisted his neck badly, and collapsed. By the time his wife checked on him, called by the sound of water pouring across the floor, Ron was unresponsive, slumped halfway out of the cabinet with the disposal still humming. The coroner later said it simply, blunt trauma from a fall while performing home maintenance, a 10-minute fix, one that never needed fixing in the first place. Number 16, Sydney Clark, 22, lived in Redding, California, and worked part-time at a local bike shop. She loved hiking, especially the small trails near Whiskeytown Lake, but she had a habit of going off-path whenever she thought she found a better view. On a warm Saturday afternoon, she set out on a short hike along the Clear Creek Trail. It was easy terrain, just dirt, rocks, trees, the usual. But near a bend in the trail, Sydney spotted a narrow slope leading down toward the water. It looked simple enough. She thought, why follow the path when I can take a shortcut to the lake? She stepped off the trail. The first few steps were fine. Loose soil, small rocks, nothing dangerous. She slid a little, laughed, and kept going. But what she didn't know was that the slope ended not at the lake, but on a thin shelf of eroded clay hanging over a 10-foot drop of jagged rock. Sydney reached the shelf and shifted her weight. The clay cracked beneath her boot, just a soft, quick sound, like snapping a thin stick. She didn't even have time to react. The ledge collapsed, sending her sideways into the rocks below. The fall wasn't far, but the angle was devastating. A headfirst impact against an outcrop that ended everything instantly. Hikers found her minutes later, their phones still searching for a signal. Sydney wasn't careless. She wasn't thrill-seeking. She just trusted a shortcut that looked a little too good to be safe. And nature doesn't offer do-overs. Number 17. Gregory Gregg. Martinez, 48, from Albuquerque, New Mexico, visited his elderly mother every Sunday. Same time, same routine, same front porch with the loose wooden step he kept meaning to fix. His mother nagged him about it every week. Greg, fix that step, someone's going to fall. He'd smile and say, next weekend, I promise. But this weekend was the last. It was a windy afternoon, dust blowing across the neighborhood, tumbleweeds rolling lazily along the curbs. Greg parked, grabbed a bag of groceries, and walked toward the porch. He stepped onto the loose plank without thinking, his mind already inside, already talking to his mother about dinner. The wood snapped, not all at once, just enough for his foot to drop halfway through. He tripped forward, arms full, unable to catch himself. He hit the ground hard, the groceries flying, his chin striking the edge of the concrete step. Stunned, he rolled to his side. But something was wrong. He couldn't breathe. The fall had caused a severe injury to his neck that he didn't recover from. A rare injury, but one paramedic sees just a few times a year. By the time his mother opened the door, hearing the thump, Greg was lying still, his phone just out of reach. She always told him that broken step would cause trouble. Neither of them expected it to be this kind. Number 18. Patricia Patty Nolan, 61, from Lansing, Michigan, taught second grade for almost 30 years. She lived alone, kept a spotless house, and hated leaving messes for future Patty. One Saturday morning, she was reorganizing her pantry when she found an old jar of pasta sauce, the kind with a metal lid that refuses to twist open. She tried once, twice, then frowned. "Fine," she muttered. "I'll warm it up. Loosen the seal." A lot of people know not to heat sealed jars. Patty wasn't one of them. She filled a small pot with water, set the jar inside, and turned on the stove. For a moment, it worked. She heard the lid pop slightly. Then the glass began to vibrate. She turned off the stove, grabbed a towel, and reached in. What she didn't know was that the jar had built up pressure inside. Not enough to explode outwards, just enough to create a perfect little grenade the moment her fingers twisted the lid. The jar shattered in her hands. The blast wasn't loud, more like a punch of heat and sharp edges. Shards of glass shot outward, one cutting her wrist in a dangerous spot. She gasped, dropped the jar, and staggered back. The injury escalated quickly, faster than she could process. She tried to wrap it with a dish towel, but the shock hit her quicker than her instincts. She collapsed before she reached her phone. The coroner later listed it simply: she didn't survive the injury, a KitchenA jar, a shortcut she'd never taken before. Patty always cleaned up messes immediately. This time, she didn't get the chance. Number 19. Trevor Lang, 34, lived in Boise, Idaho, and had what his friends like to call the confidence of a man who's been lucky too many times. Trevor loved home projects, especially ones involving ladders, changing bulbs, trimming trees, hanging decorations. He never tied the ladder down, never asked for help, never learned the safe angle. "No point," he'd say. "I'm not climbing Everest." One afternoon, he decided to clean the gutters. Nothing fancy, just a 15-minute job before dinner. He set the ladder against the side of the house, climbed halfway up, and heard it shift slightly. Most people would stop. Trevor climbed faster. At the top, he leaned sideways to reach a cluster of leaves just out of arm's length. The ladder lurched. Trevor grabbed the gutter to steady himself. A rusted aluminum gutter that was never meant to hold a human being. It tore away from the roof instantly, folding under his weight. Trevor fell backward, arms flailing, hitting the ground with a crack that echoed down the street. A neighbor ran over, calling 911, but the fall caused injuries he couldn't survive in a way paramedics couldn't reverse. It wasn't the height that killed him. He'd fallen from higher before. It was the angle, the landing, the timing. Trevor trusted luck more than physics. That afternoon, physics finally answered back. Number 20. Earl Dawson, 70, lived on a small property outside Paducah, Kentucky, the kind of place with 2 barns, a tractor from the 1970s, and a layout only he understood. Earl was old school. If something broke, he fixed it. If something made noise, he hid it. If something jammed, he forced it. One summer day, Earl noticed his riding mower was making a grinding noise. He drove it into the old barn to look at it real quick. The barn had a sloped dirt floor, uneven boards, and a ceiling fan he'd installed himself 20 years earlier. A shaky one. He left the mower running. Bad start. He leaned down to check the blades without turning it off. Another bad habit from decades of, "I know what I'm doing." But the floor sloped just enough that when he leaned forward, the mower rolled half a foot. It bumped his leg, just a light tap. But enough to knock him off balance. Earl stumbled backward into one of the barn's old wooden support beams. The beam cracked. It had been splitting for years, and the old ceiling fan above him shook loose. It didn't fall fast. It didn't fall dramatically. It just dropped, heavy and clumsy, catching him across the temple as he tried to regain his footing. By the time his grandson found him an hour later, the barn was silent except for the mower still humming. Earl had spent a lifetime fixing things that day. He trusted a machine and a building that both needed more care than he gave them. Number 21. Gloria Ramirez, 59, lived in Tucson, Arizona, and worked the opening shift at a local bakery. She prided herself on never being late, a streak she kept for nearly 15 years. One morning, she overslept by 10 minutes. Not a big deal for most people, but for Gloria, it was unacceptable. She rushed through her routine, shoes half-tied, keys in hand, purse dangling, and backed out of her driveway faster than usual. Across the street, the neighbors were having their landscaping redone, and the workers had parked their truck partially blocking her view. Gloria didn't slow down. She checked her mirror once. Sort of. And pulled into the road. At that exact second, a cyclist, with a young college student riding to class, came around the truck. Gloria saw motion, panicked, swerved hard. Her tires hit the edge of the curb. The car bounced sideways, and in the chaos, she clipped a concrete mailbox, which snapped and sent the car spinning. The impact wasn't huge, but the angle was. The airbag deployed directly into her neck in the worst possible way. Neighbors ran out, calling 911, but the paramedics said the same thing over and over. She didn't have time to brace. Gloria didn't die in a high-speed chase or a reckless stunt. She died trying to protect a perfect attendance record. On a morning, she should have taken one deep breath before backing out. Number 22. Brian McDermott, 44, lived in St. Joseph, Missouri, and worked as a delivery driver. He knew the back roads better than anyone, and he also had a habit of taking shortcuts through private lots when he thought nobody was looking. One rainy afternoon, Brian was delivering a package near an old industrial yard. He'd used the place as a shortcut for years, slip through the side gate, cut across the gravel, save a whole minute. The gate was usually open, but today, it wasn't. A new lock hung from the latch. A sign read, "Danger, active electrical site." Brian stared at the lock, annoyed. He glanced at his GPS reroute. 6 extra minutes. "Nope," he muttered. "I'm not driving around." He spotted a small gap under the fence where rainwater had eroded the soil just big enough to slide under. If he flattened himself, he got on the ground and pushed himself through. What he didn't know, what the sign actually meant, was that the yard wasn't just electrical. It was an old transformer testing site, and during storms, they grounded excess charge through the surrounding soil. The ground itself was live. The moment Brian's hands touched the wet gravel on the inside, a burst of current traveled through the puddle, up his arms and straight through him. Workers found him minutes later when the storm cleared. A shortcut he'd used 100 times became the one shortcut he never walked out of. Number 23. Melissa Hargrove, 29, lived in Richmond, Virginia, and ran the same jogging route every afternoon after work. She knew the path behind the old canal, knew where the pavement cracked, knew which tree roots stuck out. Every runner has a loop they trust, but trust can dull awareness. One hot summer afternoon, Melissa was halfway through her route when her phone buzzed, a text from her sister. She glanced down, read it quickly, and kept running while typing a short reply. Just a few words, just a few seconds of looking down. Ahead of her, the trail curved around a steep embankment where part of the asphalt had crumbled away, leaving a jagged edge and a drop into the shallow canal below. Usually she noticed it. She always stepped wide around it, but not today. While looking at her phone, she ran straight over the weakened section. It gave way under her foot like wet cardboard. She fell sideways into the canal. Not deep, not violent, but she hit the concrete lining at a perfect, terrible angle. When another jogger found her, her phone was still lit, message unsent. It wasn't the fall, it wasn't the height. It was the one moment she trusted muscle memory more than her own eyes. Routine protects you. Until it doesn't. Number 24. The quick stop. Harvey Donnelly, 67, lived in Little Rock, Arkansas, and loved taking evening walks around his neighborhood. Not power walks, just slow laps with a baseball cap, a pocket full of mints, and the same predictable route he'd walked for years. One humid summer evening, Harvey felt a little off. Not dizzy, not sick, just tired. He told himself, "I'll take the short loop tonight." Halfway through, he reached the corner convenience store and stepped inside for a cold drink. He nodded to the cashier, grabbed a bottle from the cooler, and stepped back outside, planning to sit on the curb for a minute. That's when he made a tiny, unconscious mistake. He leaned against the metal railing outside the store. Normally harmless, but that day, a delivery truck had backed into the pole earlier, bending it just enough that it wobbled. And rested against the exposed metal of the broken light fixture above, the entire rail was energized. Harvey didn't notice anything at first, just a weird buzzing in his fingers. Then his knees buckled. A passing teenager saw him collapse, ran inside for help, but by the time paramedics arrived, Harvey was gone. The city investigation found a shorted wire, a bent railing, and a man who touched the wrong place at the wrong time. Harvey didn't collapse from heat. He didn't have a heart attack. He just leaned on something countless others had leaned on before. Except, this time, the path was live. Number 25. Carson Webb, 28, lived in Wichita, Kansas, and worked long, unpredictable hours as an aviation mechanic. He wasn't athletic, but he liked walking home across a vacant field near his apartment, a straight line, instead of the long loop around the block. Everyone told him the same thing. Don't walk through that field after dark. Not because of crime, because of irrigation. The city used old underground channels and electrical pumps to manage water flow beneath the soil, and when storms rolled through, the equipment sometimes malfunctioned. Carson knew this. He just didn't care. One rainy evening, after a long overtime shift, he reached the edge of the field. Thunder rumbled. Lightning flashed somewhere in the distance. He debated for 1 second. Walk around or cut straight through? He muttered, "I'm exhausted. I'm going through." The field looked calm, but heavy rain from the previous week had soaked the ground. A storm earlier that afternoon had caused one of the buried pumps to short, energizing the puddles scattered across the field. Halfway through, Carson stepped into one that wasn't just water. It was a live pool, connected directly to the faulted pump. Neighbors heard one sharp cry, then silence. By the time anyone reached him, the storm had already swept across the city again, a 10-minute shortcut. Across a field he'd walked hundreds of times. He had no idea the ground beneath him had changed. Number 26. Robert Rob Kinsey, 50, from St. Paul, Minnesota, worked maintenance at a small warehouse. He was careful, experienced, and respected. The guy everyone trusted with the big, noisy machines. One night, near closing time, Rob noticed a conveyor belt making a slow grinding sound. Nothing dramatic, just a soft scrape every few seconds. He logged it in the maintenance book, intending to fix it in the morning. But as he grabbed his jacket to leave, he hesitated. "Let me check it real quick," he thought. It was the kind of pause that changes everything. Rob walked back across the empty warehouse, the sound echoing quietly in the big metal space. He crouched down next to the belt, listening. He should have shut off the power. He knew that. But he only needed 1 second. 1 second to pull aside a loose panel and peek inside. He reached for the panel, his fingers just inches from the moving belt, when the machine jerked. A loose internal gear finally slipped into place. The belt surged forward, and his sleeve was instantly caught. Rob tried to pull back, but the belt dragged him in with a force he never anticipated. By the time he found the emergency stop, his arm was pinned. The machine pinned him, and he didn't survive the incident. He didn't survive the impact. The warehouse cameras showed only one thing: a man who cared about his job, and made the deadly mistake of checking a live machine just for a moment. Number 27. Dennis Cole, 46, lived in Huntington, West Virginia, in a small brick house built long before modern drainage existed. Every spring, his basement took in water, not a flood, just enough to make his tools rust and boxes warp. He hated it. One rainy afternoon, Dennis noticed water pooling faster than usual. He grabbed his boots, a utility light, and his old electric sump pump, a model older than half the neighborhood. He plugged it in upstairs, carried it down, and set it in the water near the drain. The pump sputtered, coughed, and hummed like it was debating retirement. That should have been his warning. Annoyed, Dennis bent down to adjust the intake. He didn't unplug it. He didn't test the cord. He just reached into the cold, murky water with both hands. A split second later, the pump shorted. A burst of electricity surged into the pool, straight up his arms. Neighbors said the storm outside drowned out any sound he might have made. When his brother stopped by later that evening, the basement light was still on, the pump was still humming, and Dennis was lying in the water he'd been trying to remove. He didn't die in a flood. He died trying to stop one. Number 28. Leah Morton, 32, from Burlington, Vermont, loved climbing. Not professionally, not dangerously. Just the casual, I grew up in the woods, kind of climbing. Her backyard had one huge maple tree she climbed her entire childhood. It was her thinking spot, her favorite place in the world. One breezy autumn afternoon, Leah decided to trim a loose branch so it wouldn't fall during the upcoming windstorm. She could have waited for the tree service. She could have used a ladder, but nostalgia makes people confident. She climbed up barefoot, just like when she was 12. The branch she needed to reach was about 10 feet higher. She grabbed it, tested it with her weight, and felt it hold. A little creaky, but it held. What she didn't account for was the rot hidden inside the wood. Soft, unstable, waiting. She shifted her weight. The branch cracked, not loudly, just a soft, hollow snap. She fell 20 feet. Not far, but far enough to fall onto the base of the tree and didn't survive the fall, the hardest part of the ground. A neighbor heard the thump and ran over, but the angle of the fall had been exact and unforgiving. Leah didn't die climbing cliffs or rock walls. She died climbing the safest tree she knew, the one she trusted too much. Number 29, Arthur. Art Keegan, 73, lived in a small farmhouse outside Sioux Falls, South Dakota, and still did his own chores even though his kids begged him to slow down. One winter night, a windstorm rolled through, loud enough to shake the windows, strong enough to make the old barn creak. Around midnight, Art heard something slam outside. He figured it was the barn door banging. He didn't want the animals spooked, so he threw on a coat and stepped outside. Slippers, not boots, no flashlight. Just that, "I'll be back in a minute," confidence older men carry like armor. He walked across the icy yard, head down, bracing against the wind. The ground was slick, a thin glaze of ice that had formed after the temperature dropped suddenly. He reached the barn, grabbed the wooden door, and pulled hard to shut it properly. The wind shoved back. Art slipped. His feet shot forward, and he fell straight backward, falling in a way that became fatal immediately. On the frozen ground, the animals inside stirred. The wind kept howling. His daughter found him early the next morning when he didn't answer his phone. Art didn't die fighting the storm. He died doing what he'd done every winter for 40 years, checking the barn. Real quick. Number 30. Jeremy Collins, 41, lived in Canton, Ohio, and worked from home as an IT tech. Quiet guy, predictable schedule, nothing risky in his daily routine. His biggest excitement was taking his dog, Toby, out to the park after lunch. One summer afternoon, Jeremy noticed Toby had slipped out the back gate. The latch had been loose for weeks, something he kept meaning to fix. He saw the dog trotting toward the woods behind the house, not running, just exploring. Jeremy didn't panic. He jogged after him, calling, "Toby, come on, buddy!" The woods were familiar. He walked them often. But there was one part he usually avoided, a steep ravine about 50 yards in shallow water at the bottom. Loose soil along the edges. Dangerous only if you didn't pay attention. Jeremy assumed Toby wouldn't go that far, but dogs don't understand boundaries. By the time Jeremy reached the ravine, Toby was already on the far side, sniffing around like nothing was wrong. Jeremy hesitated. He could walk around, a 10-minute detour, or he could just hop across, something he'd done years ago when he was younger. He chose the hop. He took a few steps back, ran, and jumped. But the far edge, the one he aimed for, wasn't solid ground. The recent rain had softened it into a thin crust of mud. His foot punched straight through. His body twisted sideways. He hit the rocky base of the ravine, fell at a fatal angle. A hiker found Toby still waiting beside the body. An hour later, Jeremy didn't die chasing danger. He died trying to save a dog he loved and trusting ground that couldn't hold him anymore. Number 31. Marianne Doyle, 53, from Savannah, Georgia, worked the opening shift at a small cafe on River Street. She was known for three things: being early, being organized, and hating clutter. One foggy morning, she arrived before anyone else. Long before tourists drifted in, the storefront was quiet, the cobblestones damp, the river barely awake. She unlocked the door, turned on the lights, and saw leaves scattered across the outside steps. They weren't dangerous, just messy. Marianne muttered, "Let me clean this before customers see it," grabbed the broom, and stepped outside. The steps were slick from humidity, the kind of Savannah morning where the air feels wet even when it isn't raining, but she'd walked them 1,000 times. She started sweeping, slow, careful strokes. A few leaves fluttered down onto the lower step. Instead of walking down properly, she leaned forward, stretching just a little too far. Broom extended, her foot slid. She dropped the broom, tried to grab the railing, missed, and tumbled down the stone steps. Not a dramatic fall, just a fast, angled slip that ended with her. The fall ended with an impact she didn't survive. A delivery driver found her minutes later. The cafe opened late that morning. The owner said the same thing everyone thinks in moments like this. She was just sweeping. That's all. Marianne didn't die doing something risky. Just a small task she'd done every morning for years, on one set of steps that weren't as dry as she assumed. Number 32. Hannah Ruiz, 26, lived in Phoenix, Arizona, and had just moved into her first solo apartment, a small second-floor place with a narrow balcony overlooking the parking lot. The balcony railing had always been slightly loose. She mentioned it once to the landlord, got the usual, "We'll send someone," and shrugged it off. It didn't bother her. She didn't lean on it, until one evening she did. A dust storm had just rolled through, leaving dirt and leaves everywhere. Hannah, in her usual "I'll clean it myself" mode, stepped outside with a hand broom. She swept the corners first, then stepped closer to the railing to brush off the last pile of debris. The broom handle slipped. She instinctively reached to steady herself, grabbing the one thing she shouldn't have, the railing. It gave way instantly. Hannah fell straight over, a clean drop to the pavement below. No scream, no chaos, just gravity doing what gravity does. A neighbor saw the railing hanging by a single bolt and called 911, but the angle of the fall had already done its work. She wasn't reckless. She wasn't careless. She just grabbed the wrong thing at the wrong moment, in a place she assumed was safe. Number 33. Edward Eddie Parker, 65, lived in Mobile, Alabama, and worked weekends at a small marina repairing fishing boats. He wasn't the strongest, but he knew boats better than anyone. Decades of muscle memory guiding every move. On a calm Tuesday afternoon, he was fixing a loose trim panel on a boat docked at slip number 9. The job was easy, something he'd done a dozen times. He grabbed his drill, set his toolbox on the edge of the dock, and knelt down. The piece he needed to reach was just a little farther under the hull than usual. Instead of lying flat or repositioning the boat, Eddie leaned forward. Just a bit too far. His weight shifted. The board under his knee creaked. Old wood swollen from years of humidity, it cracked. Eddie toppled sideways into the water, hit the side of his head, and lost consciousness immediately on the dock post on the way down. The impact knocked him unconscious before he surfaced. A fisherman found him floating minutes later. There was no storm, no machinery, no danger anyone would have spotted. Just one bad board, one leaning motion, one quiet fall. Eddie didn't die in the ocean or in a storm. He died doing a simple task he'd done his whole life. With one small shortcut he'd taken 100 times. And that's the thing about these stories. They don't happen in explosions or chaos. They happen in kitchens, basements, parking lots, porches, and places we walk through without thinking twice. None of these people were thrill seekers. They weren't chasing danger. They weren't trying to be reckless. They were just living ordinary lives and made one small decision that went the wrong way. A shortcut, a quick fix, a familiar routine, a tiny moment where they trusted habit more than caution. And nature didn't give them a second chance. If these stories remind you of anything, it's this. Sometimes the most dangerous place you can be is comfortable. If you want more real stories, more quiet disasters, and more reminders that common sense should never take a day off. You know what to do. Like, subscribe, and stay alive out there.